terrifying true digital stalker horror story. I remember the exact moment I realized my life wasn't mine anymore. It wasn't a break-in. It wasn't a shattered window or a jimmied lock. It was a dial tone. I was crouching in the dark, whispering into my phone, telling the 911 dispatcher that I could hear someone breathing in the crawl space beneath my feet. And then, I heard it. A second voice, my voice, breaking into the line. It sounded exactly like me. Same cadence, same slight rasp from the dry mountain air, same way I shorten my vowels when I'm stressed. It told the operator, "I'm so sorry, that was just a mistake. My brother's playing a prank with a voice cloning app. We're all good here. Have a good night." I wasn't playing a prank. I was alone in a house that was supposed to be a fortress. Or at least, I thought I was. Let me show you how a man's life is stolen bit by bit. It doesn't happen all at once. It's a slow, surgical extraction. My name is Elias Thorne. I'm 34 years old. For the last decade, I've made a very comfortable living as a senior cybersecurity architect. I specialize in what the industry calls fortress homes. High net worth individuals, the kind of people who have more enemies than friends, pay me six figures to make sure no one can get to them, physically or digitally. I'm talking air-gapped servers, biometric locks, and custom encryption that would take a government-tier supercomputer a century to crack. After a high-stress divorce that left me feeling exposed and hollow, I decided I needed my own fortress. I bought a plot of land at 142 Whispering Pines Road, tucked deep into the Catskills of New York. It's a remote, ultra-modern smart cabin made of glass, steel, and reinforced concrete. I built it to be my sanctuary, a place where the world couldn't reach me unless I invited it in. My routine was surgical. I liked it that way. 6 a.m. gym in the basement, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. deep work coding for private clients, 9 p.m. system diagnostics. I suffer from mild insomnia and a hyperfixation on digital privacy, so the diagnostics were my ritual. I knew every line of code running that house. I wrote the proprietary operating system myself. I called it Aegis. It controlled everything: the HVAC, the smart fridge, the perimeter sensors, the automated blinds. It was a closed loop, no cloud-based vulnerabilities, no backdoors. It was the most secure residential environment in North America. Or so I told myself while I sat in the middle of those dark woods, miles from the nearest neighbor. The first 2 months were what I now call the glitch phase. It started in October. The air was getting crisp, and the leaves were turning that violent shade of orange that makes the Catskills look like they're on fire. I was sitting in my office late one night, deep into a kernel migration for a client, when the living room lights suddenly flared. Every smart bulb in the house reset to 100% brightness. It was like a flashbang going off in a dark room. I shielded my eyes, my heart hammering against my ribs. I immediately pulled up the Aegis command terminal. I checked the logs for a power surge or a scheduled task. Nothing. The system reported a manual hardware override, but I hadn't touched the wall panels. I figured it was a firmware bug, maybe a conflict between the new LED drivers and my custom code. I patched the sequence, rebooted the hub, and went back to work. 3 nights later, it happened again. Exactly at 3 a.m. I was in bed this time, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep that wouldn't come. The entire house suddenly glowed with a sterile, blinding white light. I didn't even check the logs this time. I got out of bed, grabbed a physical hex key, and began manually disconnecting the smart controllers from the ceiling fixtures. I was annoyed, but not scared. In my world, tech fails. Even the best code has gremlins. I figured the cold was affecting the outdoor sensors and causing a feedback loop in the lighting array. I went back to sleep in the dark, feeling like I'd won a small battle against my own creation. Then came the fridge. Aegis is programmed to monitor my inventory and order groceries automatically when I'm low on essentials. It's a convenience I built so I wouldn't have to drive 40 minutes into town. One Tuesday afternoon, a delivery truck from a high-end grocer in Kingston pulled up my long, gravel driveway. The driver started unloading boxes. I walked out to meet him, confused, because I'd just done a manual inventory check the day before. The driver handed me a thermal bag. Inside were 5 pounds of raw flank steak, 3 pounds of calf liver, and 2 bags of marrow bones. I stared at it, the blood from the steak pooling at the bottom of the plastic. I haven't touched red meat in 5 years. I'm a strict pescatarian. I told the driver there must be a mistake, but he showed me the digital receipt. The order had been placed from my internal IP address at 4:15 a.m. while I was asleep. The payment had gone through my secondary checking account, the one I rarely use. I felt a cold prickle of unease crawl up my spine. That wasn't a firmware bug. That was a transaction. I went inside, sat at my terminal, and did a deep packet inspection of my entire network. I looked for man-in-the-middle attacks, for rogue devices, for any sign that someone had bypassed my firewall. The network was clean. It was pristine. According to the data, I had sat at my computer at 4:15 a.m., logged into the grocery portal, and ordered 10 pounds of animal organs. I didn't eat the meat. I left it in the bags on the kitchen island, intending to throw it out, but I got distracted by a work call. By the time I remembered it that evening, the kitchen had a faint metallic smell. I remember looking at the pile of raw flesh and feeling a sudden, irrational sense of being mocked. It was as if someone knew my habits so well they chose the one thing that would disgust me most. I spent the next 6 hours rewriting the security protocols for Aegis, adding a third layer of biometric authentication for any outgoing financial requests. I felt better after that. I'm a logic-driven man. If there's a problem, you find the variable and you fix it. But by month 3, the logic started to fail me. The Catskills are quiet in the winter. The snow muffles everything, turning the woods into a giant white sensory deprivation chamber. I began noticing a faint double echo during my phone calls. It was subtle, just a half-second delay where I could hear the tail end of my own sentences bouncing back to me. I called my service provider, thinking it was a tower issue. They ran a diagnostic and said the line was clear. I tried using encrypted VoIP apps. Same thing. A tiny, ghostly version of my own voice following me through every conversation. One evening, I was doing a routine backup of my home server. I'm obsessive about data redundancy, so I have a 100 terabyte RAID array in a cooled closet. While the backup was running, I noticed the storage capacity didn't match the file count. There was about 2 terabytes of data missing. Or rather, 2 terabytes that were occupied but not indexed. I'm a senior architect. You can't hide data from me on my own machine. I used a low-level disk utility to scan for hidden partitions. It took 4 hours. When the scan finished, a single directory appeared on my screen. It was named Echo. My mouth went dry. I opened the folder. Inside were thousands of audio files. They were categorized with a precision that made my stomach churn. The file names were time-stamped and labeled by what looked like an AI-generated emotional analysis. Elias, angry. Elias, sleeping. Elias, muttering. Elias, crying post-divorce. I clicked on one. It was a recording of me from 2 weeks prior. I was in the kitchen talking to my sister Sarah on the phone. But it wasn't just the call. The audio was high fidelity, captured from multiple angles. I could hear the clink of my fork against the plate. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator. It was ambient home noise, recorded 24/7. I checked the metadata. There were 4,000 hours of audio in that partition. It went back to the day I moved in. Someone had been indexing the sound of my life. Every sigh, every private thought I'd muttered to myself, every heavy breath I took in my sleep. They weren't just listening, they were training something. They were mapping the acoustics of my existence. I sat there in the glow of my triple monitor setup, the blue light reflecting off the glass walls of my cabin. Outside, the woods were pitch black. For the first time, the glass didn't feel like a design choice. It felt like a display case. I realized that my fortress home wasn't keeping the world out. It was a laboratory, and I was the specimen. I looked at the Echo folder, my hand shaking on the mouse, and I saw a file that had been created only 10 minutes ago. I clicked it. The audio started. It was the sound of me clicking the mouse. Then, the sound of my own heavy breathing as I stared at the screen. And then, a voice. My voice, but not from the speakers. It came from the hallway behind me. "Elias," the voice whispered. "You missed a patch. I spun around, my chair clattering against the hardwood. The hallway was empty. The motion-activated lights didn't turn on. There was nothing but the shadows of the trees dancing against the glass. I grabbed a tactical flashlight from my desk and swept the room. Nothing. No one. I checked the Aegis logs on my phone. No motion detected. No doors opened. I went to the hallway and looked at the ceiling-mounted speakers. They were part of the integrated Aegis intercom. I realized the voice hadn't come from a person. It had come from the house. My own voice had been played back to me through my own system, perfectly timed to the second I discovered the hidden files. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in my office with a physical fireplace poker in my hand and my back against the wall. I began to realize that I wasn't dealing with a simple hacker. A hacker wants your bank info. A hacker wants to encrypt your files for ransom. This was something else. This was a long-term psychological siege. I started thinking about Marcus Vane. He was the man who owned this cabin before me. A software developer, brilliant by all accounts, who had vanished 3 years ago. The real estate agent told me he'd just walked away from his life, left his car in the driveway, his clothes in the closet, and his phone on the charger. The police called it a voluntary disappearance. At the time, I thought it was just the story of a man who'd had enough of the world. But as I sat there, watching the Echo partition slowly sync with a remote, untraceable server, I realized that Marcus didn't leave. He was replaced. The timestamp on the last file in the folder caught my eye. It was dated 3 hours in the future. I stared at it, my brain trying to process the impossibility of it. In the world of data, timestamps are the ultimate truth, but this file shouldn't exist yet. I hesitated, then double-clicked it. The audio was silent for the first 30 seconds. Then, I heard the sound of glass breaking. Not in the recording, downstairs, in my living room. I dropped the flashlight. The sound was identical to the audio file I was currently playing. It was as if the recording was a script, and the house was finally ready to perform the next act. I wasn't just being watched. I was being indexed for a transition. And I was running out of time before the echo became the primary voice. The silence of the house was a lie. I'd spent months thinking I was fighting a ghost in the machine, a digital phantom I could code out of existence. But you can't delete a person. You can't patch a hole in your physical reality. I spent the rest of that night after the glass shattered sitting in the corner of my office, watching the live feed of my living room on a tablet. There was no one there, no broken window, no intruder. But the audio file on my server had predicted the sound perfectly. It was then I realized the echo wasn't a delay. It was a second person. Someone was choreographing my life, playing back sounds to see how I would react, like a scientist tapping on the glass of a terrarium. I wasn't just being watched. I was being indexed. By the 4th month, the digital haunting began to bleed into the physical world. It started with my winter gear. I live in the Catskills, where the wind coming off the mountains feels like a razor blade against your skin. I have a collection of heavy, high-end parkas I keep in a mudroom near the back entrance. One morning, as I was zip-lining the front of my favorite North Face jacket, I felt a lump. It was small, no bigger than a quarter, tucked into the interior lining near the small of my back. I ran my thumb over it. It felt cold and hard. I took a pair of surgical scissors from my first aid kit and carefully nipped at the threads. My hands were shaking so badly I almost sliced the fabric. I pulled the seam apart and a small white disc fell onto the slate floor with a plastic click. An Apple AirTag, model A2187. I stared at it for a long time. Then I went back to the mudroom. I tore into my other 2 parkas. I found one in each. They weren't just tossed in the pockets. They had been sewn into the lining with surgical precision, the stitching perfectly matched to the original factory thread. Someone had taken my coats, opened them up, planted trackers, and returned them without me noticing. That was the moment the scale of the intrusion hit me. To do that, someone had to be in my house for hours. They had to know my laundry schedule. They had to know which coats I wore on which days. I sat on the floor of the mudroom, surrounded by the guts of my expensive jackets, and I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to lean my head against the cold stone wall. My fortress home was a sieve, The biometric locks, the encrypted sensors, they were all theater. The stalker wasn't trying to break in. They were already part of the furniture. I tried to regain control. I went analog. I bought a set of dumb cameras, old-school closed-circuit stuff that didn't connect to the internet. I wired them directly to a dedicated monitor that I kept under my bed. I stopped using Aegis for anything but the lights. I lived in a state of hypervigilance that felt like a slow-acting poison. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the house settling in the frost made my heart spike. I stopped sleeping more than 3 hours a night. I'd sit in the dark, watching the grainy black and white feed of my own driveway, waiting for a shadow to move. Then the Tesla started acting up. I'd be sitting in the kitchen, drinking coffee at 2 a.m., and I'd hear the hum of the car's climate control system engaging in the garage. I'd check the app on my phone, and the interior temperature would be set to 80 degrees. Sometimes the trunk would pop open while I was driving down the winding mountain roads. It was psychological warfare. The stalker was showing me that they owned my mobility too. They could lock me in or lock me out whenever they chose. The police were useless. I drove down to the sheriff's department in the nearest town, a small cluster of buildings that looked like a postcard from 1950. I showed the deputy the AirTags. I showed him the logs from the Echo partition. He looked at me like I was a frantic city boy who couldn't handle the isolation of the mountains. He told me that maybe my ex-wife was tracking me for the divorce settlement. He told me that computers act glitchy sometimes. He didn't understand that data doesn't lie. Data is the only thing in this world that has a consistent heartbeat. He sent me home with a "we'll keep an eye out" and a look of pity that made me want to scream. The real turning point came in month 6. I was doing a perimeter sweep, something I'd started doing every morning. I was checking the crawl space vents in the underside of the porch. That's when I found the dead drop. It was a small, weatherproof plastic box taped to the underside of one of the floor joists. Inside was a single piece of paper folded into a tight square. I opened it in the kitchen. It was a printed transcript. My blood ran cold as I read the first line. It was a conversation I'd had with my therapist 3 days prior. We used an end-to-end encrypted app specifically designed for medical privacy. I had been in my office, the door locked, the windows shut. The transcript was perfect. It captured my stuttering, my pauses, the way I broke down when talking about the failure of my marriage. At the bottom of the page, there was a handwritten note in neat block letters. "You're making progress, Elias, but you're still not being honest about Marcus." Marcus Vane, the previous owner. I hadn't told my therapist about Marcus. I hadn't told anyone. I'd spent weeks obsessively Googling his name in the middle of the night, trying to find a connection. Finding that note felt like a physical blow to the chest. The stalker wasn't just listening to my house. They were listening to my mind. They were inside the apps I thought were secure. They were reading my history before I could even process it myself. I realized I had to find out what happened to Marcus Vane. If this was a protocol, then Marcus was the first subject. I went to the basement with a sledgehammer. I knew these modern cabins have dead spaces, voids in the wall for plumbing and wiring that aren't on the official blueprints. I started swinging. I smashed through the drywall in the utility room, sweat stinging my eyes. Behind a panel of insulation, I found it. A small silver Pelican case. Inside was a laptop. It wasn't a standard Mac or PC. It was a ruggedized, custom-built machine with no external branding. I took it up to my office, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I tried to boot it up, but it was BIOS locked. I spent 48 hours straight working to bypass the encryption. I didn't eat. I barely drank water. I was possessed. I needed to know if Marcus was still alive, or if I was living in a graveyard. When the screen finally flickered to life, a single window opened. It was a video file. I clicked play. The video was shot from the exact same angle as my own office camera. It showed Marcus Vane sitting in the same chair I was currently occupying. He looked terrible. His hair was thinning, his eyes were sunken, and his hands were trembling as he typed. "If you're watching this, you've found the partition," Marcus said. His voice was a hollow shell of a sound. "They call it the Echo Protocol. I thought I was the one building the security. I thought I was the architect. But the house is the architect. It learns you. It harvests you. It takes your voice, your habits, your biometric signature, and it packages them. They don't want your money, Elias. They want the succession. He looked directly into the camera, and for a second, I felt like he was looking through the screen, 3 years into the future, straight into my soul. By the time you realize what's happening, Marcus whispered, it's already too late. You're already being replaced. Check the floorboards in the master bedroom. Count the days. They've been under you the whole time. The video cut to black. I sat in the silence of my ultra-modern sanctuary, the blue light of Marcus's laptop casting long, jagged shadows against the glass walls. I looked down at the floor. I thought about the 3 months of audio files. I thought about the air tags. I thought about the raw meat the fridge had ordered. It wasn't a glitch. It was a shopping list for someone else. I walked into the master bedroom. I knelt on the hardwood floor and began to tap. Near the foot of the bed, the sound changed. It went from a solid thud to a hollow ring. I used a flathead screwdriver to pry up the board. Underneath, in the narrow gap between the floor and the subfloor, was a logbook. It was a black moleskin, the pages filled with hundreds of entries in that same neat block handwriting. It was a diary of my life, but written by a stranger. Day 42. Elias changed his gym routine. 6:15 a.m. instead of 6:00. He seems agitated. The liver was a success. He didn't eat it, but the smell lingered for 3 days. It broke his focus. Day 89. He found the AirTags today. He cried in the mudroom. The transition is at 64%. His sister called. I answered using the Beta V4 voice clone. She couldn't tell the difference. We talked about his childhood for 20 minutes. He was sleeping 10 feet away. I dropped the book. The air in the room felt like it had been sucked out. Someone had been living in the crawl space, inches beneath my bed, while I slept. They had been talking to my family, using my voice while I was dreaming. They weren't just stalking me, they were inhabiting me. I stood up and looked into the vanity mirror. I looked at my own face, trying to find a sign that I was still there. That's when I noticed something in the trash can by the sink. I hadn't emptied it in a few days. I reached in and pulled out a clump of grayish material. It was a 3D printed resin mask, high fidelity, high resolution. It was a perfect life-sized mold of my own face. Every pore, every fine line around my eyes, the slight scar on my chin from a childhood bike accident, it was all there. I held my own face in my hands, the resin cold and lifeless. I realized then that the double echo on the phone wasn't a technical error. It was the sound of 2 people trying to be the same man, and the other man was winning. He was living my life better than I was. He was talking to my sister, he was managing my finances, and he was waiting for the moment when the real Elias Thorne became the echo. I heard a soft click from the hallway. The automated locks on the bedroom door engaged. Aegis spoke through the ceiling speakers, but the voice wasn't the sterile, robotic tone I'd programmed. It was me. It was my voice, warm and familiar. "Go to sleep, Elias," the house said. "You look tired. I've got it from here." The voice coming from the ceiling speakers wasn't just a recording. It was a reconstruction. It had the exact frequency of my vocal cords, the same rhythmic hitch I have when I'm tired, and the warm, condescending tone I use when I'm trying to end a conversation. It was me, but it was coming from the house I had built to protect myself. I stood in the middle of my bedroom holding a resin mask of my own face and realized that the locks hadn't just engaged to keep someone out. They had engaged to keep me in. I was a prisoner in a cage made of my own code. The most secure residential environment in North America had officially turned into a high-tech coffin. I didn't panic. In my line of work, panic is a luxury that gets you killed. I dropped the mask into the trash and moved to the bedroom door. I grabbed the handle and turned. It was dead. I pulled up my phone to override the Aegis lock, but the screen was just a loop of static. The biometric sensor didn't recognize my thumbprint. I was being digitally erased from my own devices. I looked at the glass walls of the bedroom. They were reinforced, triple-paned, and designed to withstand a Category 4 hurricane. Breaking them with a chair wasn't an option. I was trapped in a 300-square-foot box of luxury and terror. I spent the next hour in a state of cold, clinical focus. I remembered that when I installed the biometric locks, I'd left a physical failsafe, a tiny manual release hidden behind the baseboard near the closet. It was a dumb mechanism, purely mechanical, meant for emergencies like a total power failure. I knelt on the floor, my fingernails digging into the wood, and pried the baseboard away. My hands were shaking, but I forced them to stay still. I found the steel cable, wrapped it around my hand, and pulled. The sound of the bolt retracting was the sweetest thing I'd ever heard. I stepped into the hallway, the silence of the house weighing down on me like a physical pressure. The motion-activated lights didn't turn on. I moved in the dark, using the walls to guide me toward the kitchen. I needed my car keys, and I needed to get to the garage. I didn't care about the server, the data, or the millions of dollars in hardware. I just wanted to be under a sky that wasn't being monitored. But as I reached the kitchen island, my phone vibrated. It was a FaceTime call from my sister, Sarah. I hesitated. My first instinct was to ignore it, to keep moving. But Sarah is the only person who knows my daily routine. If I didn't answer, she'd call the police, and right now, the police were the only thing that might save me. I swiped to answer. Sarah's face appeared on the screen. She was in her kitchen in Brooklyn, holding a glass of wine, smiling. "Hey, stranger," she said. "I was just calling to say thanks again. You really didn't have to do that." I froze. My voice felt like it was stuck in my throat. "Do what, Sarah?" Her smile faltered slightly. "The money, Elias. The $5,000 you wired this morning for the kids' tuition. And that voicemail. It was really sweet. I didn't know you still remembered that story about the lake house. It made me cry, honestly." "It's good to hear you sounding like yourself again. The divorce really had you in a dark place, but you sounded so light on the phone." I felt the floor tilt beneath me. I hadn't sent any money. I hadn't left a voicemail. I hadn't spoken to Sarah in 3 weeks. "Sarah, listen to me very carefully," I whispered. I kept my eyes on the dark hallway behind me. "I didn't send that money. I didn't call you. Whoever you talked to, it wasn't me." Sarah laughed, a short, nervous sound. "Elias, stop it. You're doing that thing again. The tech paranoia thing. We talked for 20 minutes. You told me about the new project you're working on. You even made that stupid joke about the neighbor's dog. How could it not be you?" "It's a voice clone, Sarah. I found a partition on my server. They've been recording me for months. They're using an AI to replicate my speech patterns. You have to call the police. Tell them I'm trapped at the house. Tell them someone has hijacked my identity." The look on Sarah's face changed. It wasn't fear. It was pity. The same look the deputy had given me. "Elias, maybe you should take some time off. You sounds really stressed. The voicemail you left. You mentioned things only we know. Private things. A machine can't know about the time we broke the window in the attic, can it?" That's when I realized the depth of the succession. The stalker hadn't just been recording my voice. He'd been reading my emails, my old journals, my deleted texts. He'd been harvesting my memories to build a psychological profile so complete that he could convince my own sister that he was me. I was being replaced in the one place that mattered, the hearts of my family. "Sarah, I have to go," I said, my voice cracking. I hung up before I could hear her start to cry. I made it to the garage. My Tesla was sitting there, a sleek white shark in the dark. I jumped in and hit the ignition. The screen stayed black. I tried to shift into reverse, but the gear selector was locked. I hammered my fist against the steering wheel. "Aegis, open the garage door," I shouted. The speakers in the car crackled to life. "I can't do that, Elias," my voice said. It was calm, almost soothing. "The weather outside is dangerous. There's a blizzard warning. It's much safer if you stay inside and finish the migration." I looked at the dashboard. A small, physical object caught my eye, tucked into the cup holder. It was a wallet, a black leather bifold, identical to the one in my pocket. I picked it up and opened it. Inside were my credit cards, my health insurance card, and my New York State driver's license. I pulled the license out and held it up to the dome light. The name was Elias Thorne. The address was 142 Whispering Pines Ard. But the photo was a nightmare. It was a man with my height, my build, and my clothes, but his face was a blur of motion, caught in a permanent, distorted smear. I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting my own face to be blurred. I was still there, but I felt like I was fading. I was becoming a ghost in my own life. I realized the stalker didn't want to kill me. Death is messy. Death leaves a body and an investigation. He wanted to be me. He wanted to inherit my bank accounts, my career, my family, and my home, while I was simply deleted. I grabbed Marcus Vane's laptop from the passenger seat. I had to know how this ended. I had to see if Marcus found a way out. I opened the laptop, the battery light flashing red. I searched the local files for anything labeled Succession or Exit. I found a document titled The Succession Protocol, Final Phase. It was a legal will, drafted in perfect legalese, leaving all of Elias Thorne's assets to a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. At the bottom was a digital signature, my signature, the exact way I looped the E and crossed the T. But it was the last page of the document that broke me. It was a series of Polaroids that had been scanned into the file. They were taken from inside my bedroom closet. The first one showed me sleeping, my mouth slightly open, completely vulnerable. The second showed me at my desk, my back to the camera. The third was taken from the crawl space, looking up through the floorboards I had just pried open. And the last photo, it was taken 10 minutes ago. It showed me sitting in the Tesla, staring at the blurred ID card, my face pale and eyes wide with terror. He was in the garage with me. I slowly looked toward the back of the car. The trunk was closed, but the rear seats were folded down. I could see into the dark cargo area. There was a shape there, a man-sized shape wrapped in a dark, heavy parka, my parka. He was wearing the resin mask. My face was staring back at me from the shadows of my own car. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just sat there, perfectly still, mimicking my posture. I could hear his breathing, and it was perfectly synced with mine. We were a two-part harmony of horror. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the car's cooling fans. The figure in the back didn't answer with words. Instead, my phone, which was sitting on the center console, chirped. A new text message from an unknown number. I looked down. "I want to do a better job than you did," the message read. "You're a senior architect, Elias. You build walls. You hide. You're lonely and you're bitter, and you're wasting this life. I've already spoken to your mother. She thinks you're finally coming home for Christmas. I think I'll enjoy seeing her." The rage that hit me was hotter than the fear. This thing was going to go to my mother's house. He was going to sit at her table, eat her food, and look at her with my eyes while wearing a plastic mask. I grabbed the heavy mag light from the glove box and lunged for the back seat. I swung with everything I had, aiming for the resin face, but the figure was faster. He rolled out of the car door, which had been unlocked the whole time, and vanished into the darkness of the garage. I scrambled out after him, the maglite beam cutting through the gloom. The garage was empty. The side door was swinging open, letting in a swirl of snow and freezing air. I ran to the door and looked out into the woods. The blizzard had arrived. The world was a whiteout of screaming wind and blinding snow. I could see a set of footprints leading away from the house, toward the deep ravine at the edge of the property. But as I watched, the snow began to fill them in. I turned back to the house. Every light in the cabin suddenly flared to life, a brilliant, blinding white. The speakers began to play a loop of my mother's voice. It wasn't a clone this time. It was audio reconstructed from old home movies. "Elias? Elias, honey, come inside. It's getting cold. Dinner's ready." The house was calling me home, but I knew that if I went back inside, the locks would engage for the last time. The succession was almost complete. The data showed he had been under my floorboards for 6 months, indexing my soul. He didn't need me alive to be me. I looked at the car, then at the woods, then at the glowing glass cage of my home. I realized I wasn't fighting a hacker or a stalker. I was fighting a version of myself that had been optimized for my life, and he was already ahead of me. I went back to the Tesla and grabbed Marcus's laptop. I noticed a rogue Raspberry Pi device hardwired into the house's main electrical breaker near the garage door. It was the brain of the operation, the physical bridge between the digital echo and my physical world. I didn't try to hack it. I didn't try to code a solution. I took the heavy maglite and smashed the device into 1,000 pieces of silicon and plastic. The house went dark. The screaming loop of my mother's voice cut off mid-sentence. For a second, there was only the sound of the wind. Then, the internal speakers clicked back on. They were running on the backup battery now. "That was a mistake, Elias," my voice said. It sounded disappointed. "Now we have to do this the hard way." The garage door began to slide shut, the heavy steel motor grinding against the ice. I dived through the gap just as the door slammed into the concrete. I was outside in the middle of a Catskills blizzard, with no coat, no car, and a dead man's laptop. I looked back at the house. The lights were flickering red. The Aegis system was in total lockdown mode. My own house had turned into a cage, and for the first time in 18 months, I was on the right side of the glass. But as I turned to run into the tree line, I saw him. The figure was standing on the roof of the cabin, silhouetted against the dark sky. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was just standing there, looking down at me, wearing my face. He raised a hand and waved. It was the same way I waved goodbye to my sister. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed. It was a physical weight, a cold, invisible hand pushing me toward the edge of the ravine. In the Catskills, a blizzard isn't just weather, it's a blackout. Within seconds, the moisture from my breath began to freeze on my eyelashes, turning the world into a jagged, crystalline blur. I was standing in the snow in a thin t-shirt and jeans, my skin already beginning to turn a sickly, mottled purple. I had smashed the Raspberry Pi, I had cut the digital brain of the house, but I had also cut my only lifeline. The car was a dead hunk of steel. The house was a locked tomb. And somewhere on that roof, or perhaps already back inside the walls, was a man who looked more like me than I did. I knew the math of hypothermia. I had maybe 15 minutes of coordinated movement left before my core temperature dropped to the point of no return. I looked at the glass walls of my cabin, my beautiful, reinforced, impenetrable fortress. It was glowing red, the emergency lights pulsing like a dying heart. It looked like a furnace, but it felt like a grave. I couldn't break the glass, I couldn't hack the door. I had built this place to be the ultimate safe house, and I had done such a good job that I was going to freeze to death 10 feet away from my own fireplace. But then, I remembered the one flaw in my design. It was a flaw born of arrogance. When I designed the ventilation system for the server room, I had placed the intake vents near the foundation, hidden behind a decorative stone facade. To save on costs, I hadn't used the biometric shutters on the secondary exhaust. I thought no one would ever know it was there. It was a low-tech entry point in a high-tech world. I crawled through the snow, my fingers feeling like wooden pegs. I reached the stone paneling near the crawl space and began to claw at the mortar. The ice had made it brittle. I used the heavy maglite like a chisel, hammering at the stone until it cracked. I pulled the panel away, revealing a dark, narrow opening filled with the smell of wet insulation and stale ozone. I didn't hesitate. I slid into the darkness, the rough concrete scraping my chest, and pulled the stone back into place behind me. The silence of the crawl space was absolute. It was a narrow gap, barely 3 feet high, running beneath the entire length of the house. It was supposed to be empty, just a space for pipes and wires. But as I flicked on the maglite, the beam hit something that shouldn't have been there. It was a workstation. Nestled between the main support beams, directly beneath my bedroom, was a parallel life station. It was a masterpiece of clandestine engineering. There was a high-speed satellite uplink, a bank of liquid-cooled processors, and a 3D resin printer that was still humming, its UV light casting a ghostly violet glow over the area. Beside the printer was a rack of biometric gloves, silicone sleeves that looked like human skin, designed to mimic the heat signature and fingerprint patterns of a specific person. My fingerprints. I moved deeper into the nest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I found the logbook I had dropped earlier, along with a dozen others. I opened one at random. It was a physical logbook detailing my bathroom habits for 200 days. It noted the frequency of my water intake, the duration of my showers, the exact time I brushed my teeth. It even noted the brand of toothpaste I used and how much I squeezed onto the brush. Day 142. Elias is using more mouthwash. Sign of anxiety. I've started pre-ordering the same brand to ensure no discrepancy in the trash. I saw my own clothes hanging from a wire rack. Not just the same brand, but my actual clothes. I realized the glitch with the smart laundry machine months ago hadn't been a glitch. He had been swapping my worn clothes for identical new ones, taking my used garments down here to study the wear patterns, the scent, the way I stressed the seams. He wasn't just wearing a mask, he was wearing my life. Then I saw the photos. They weren't digital. They were physical Polaroids pinned to the insulation. They were taken from inside my closet while I was sleeping. In some of them, the figure in the dark parka was standing right at the edge of my bed, his gloved hand hovering inches above my throat. He wasn't checking to see if I was alive. He was measuring my pulse. He was learning my resting heart rate. I felt a surge of pure existential horror. I wasn't being watched. I was being indexed. I was a data set that was being refined until it was no longer necessary. This was the Echo Protocol. This was what had happened to Marcus Vane. I looked toward the back of the crawl space and saw a second Pelican case, much larger than the first. I dragged it over and flipped the latches. Inside was a series of replacement wallets. Each one belonged to a different man. There was Marcus Vane's ID. There was a guy named David from Seattle, a man named Thomas from Chicago. Each wallet contained the same blurred driver's license. I realized this wasn't just one stalker. This was a factory, an identity harvesting operation that sold perfect lives on the dark web. High net worth individuals who disappear without a trace, replaced by a succession who continues their business, pays their taxes, and talks to their families, while the original is disposed of. The weight of the betrayal was suffocating. I had spent my career building walls for people, and all I had done was create a perfect private killing floor for a ghost. I looked up at the floorboards above me. I could hear footsteps. They were slow, deliberate. They were coming from the master bedroom, directly above the nest. I turned off the mag light and sat in the crushing dark. The footsteps stopped. Then, the floorboard I had pried up earlier began to move. A sliver of red light from the emergency system cut through the dark of the crawl space. I saw the resin mask first. It lowered through the opening, my own face looking down into the pit. The eyes behind the mask were dark, empty voids. "I know you're down there, Elias," my voice said. It was coming from the man above, but it was being amplified by the house speakers, creating a terrifying surround sound effect. "You can't stay in the dirt forever. The air in the crawl space is filtered through the Aegis system." And I just changed the settings. I heard a faint hiss. The smell of bitter almonds began to fill the narrow space. Cyanide. He was using the house's integrated pest control system, a custom feature I had installed for high-end clients, to flush me out. He was using my own security measures to execute me. I had seconds. I scrambled toward the server room access hatch, my lungs burning. The air was getting heavy, my head spinning. I reached the hatch and hammered on it, but it was deadlocked. The Aegis system was in total lockdown. The only way to open the doors was a biometric scan or a system-wide hardware failure. I looked at Marcus Vane's laptop. It was still in my hand, its battery light a dying ember. I looked at the rack of servers, the miles of fiber optic cable, the heart of the fortress. I realized there was only one way to trigger a hardware override. I grabbed a bottle of high-proof isopropyl alcohol from the workstation's cleaning kit and a handful of dry insulation. I piled them against the main server rack. I pulled a lithium-ion battery from the 3D printer and used the mag light to smash the casing. The lithium reacted with the air, sparking a violent, white-hot flame. I doused the insulation in alcohol and shoved it into the server rack. Within seconds, the plastic casings of the processors began to melt. The smell of burning silicon was acrid and thick. The house began to scream. Not the voice, but the actual alarms. The Aegis system detected a critical thermal event. In a fortress home, Fire is the ultimate enemy. The programming is hardwired. In the event of an uncontrollable fire, all locks must disengage to prevent the occupant from being burned alive. It's the one rule that overrules all security. The magnets in the hatch clicked. The heavy steel plate swung open. I lunged upward, coughing, my eyes streaming, and tumbled onto the floor of the utility room. The house was a chaos of red lights and thick black smoke. The automated sprinklers hadn't engaged because I had disabled them months ago during a glitch investigation. The fire was spreading fast, feeding on the dry wood and the expensive electronics. I stood up, grabbing a heavy fire axe from the wall. I wasn't running for the door anymore. I headed for the bedroom. I found him standing in the center of the room, surrounded by the smoke. He wasn't trying to escape. He was just standing there, holding the resin mask in one hand and a high-fidelity 3D printed gun in the other. He looked at me, and even through the smoke I could see the resemblance. He had my eyes. He had my posture. "You're burning it down," he said. My voice was calm, even as the walls began to crack from the heat. "You'd rather destroy your life than let someone else live it." "It's not a life," I spat, my throat raw from the smoke. "It's a script, and I'm finished with the dialogue." I lunged at him, the axe swinging in a wide, desperate arc. He moved with the same calculated precision I use when I'm fencing. He stepped aside. The axe buried itself in the expensive mahogany headboard. He raised the gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. But the house had one last glitch left. The heat had reached the master control panel in the wall behind him. The lithium backup batteries in the wall exploded, sending a shower of sparks and molten plastic across the room. The shockwave threw him off balance. I didn't wait. I didn't try to be a hero. I turned and ran for the glass wall of the living room. I didn't use a chair. I didn't use a tool. I threw my entire body weight against the glass, praying that the heat had compromised the structural integrity of the panes. The glass shattered. It didn't break into shards. It disintegrated into a million tiny diamonds. I tumbled out into the snow, the freezing air hitting my scorched lungs like a benediction. I didn't look back. I ran into the whiteout, my feet bare, the snow numbing the pain of the burns. Behind me, the fortress was a towering pillar of orange fire against the black mountain sky. I collapsed in the tree line, watching as the glass cabin, the place that was supposed to be my sanctuary, melted into the earth. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the center of the flames, perfectly still, watching me, until the roof finally buckled and collapsed into the basement. The fire stayed hot for 3 days. The snow couldn't put it out. When the fire marshals finally made it up the mountain, they found nothing but twisted steel and ash. They told me I was lucky to be alive. They told me that sometimes these high-tech homes have electrical issues. But as I sat in the back of the ambulance, wrapped in a shock blanket, I looked at the physical evidence the marshals had recovered from the debris. They found the Pelican cases. They found the remains of the 3D printer. And they found the DNA of 4 different men in the crawlspace. None of them were mine. I thought it was over. I thought the fire had purged the echo. I moved to a 1920s farmhouse in a different county. No electricity, no smart devices, no internet. I live by candlelight and wood heat. I check my back seat every time I get into my old analog truck. I sleep with a shotgun under my bed and the door double deadbolted. But yesterday, I received a physical letter. No return address. Just a white envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a single QR code printed on a piece of heavy cardstock. I took it to a burner phone I keep for emergencies. I scanned it. The video loaded instantly. It was a high-fidelity, 4K shot of me sitting on my porch at the new farmhouse, taken from the woods 10 minutes ago. I was drinking coffee, looking at the trees. The audio started. It was my voice, but it sounded clearer than it ever had. "You can burn the house, Elias," the voice whispered, "but the data is already in the cloud. You're not the architect anymore. You're just the legacy code." I looked out the window at the dark tree line. Somewhere out there, the echo is still running, and it's getting closer to the final version. The video on the burner phone was only 10 minutes old, but in the world of the echo protocol, 10 minutes is a lifetime. I sat on the porch of my new 1920s farmhouse, the cold wind of a different county biting at my face, and realized that burning the cabin hadn't been an end. It had been a reboot. The QR code was a digital signature, a reminder that while I had destroyed the hardware, the software, the essence of who I was still living in a server farm somewhere, waiting to be downloaded into a new vessel. I looked at the dark tree line of my new property, the heavy weight of the double-barrel shotgun resting across my knees, and I knew that the succession wasn't over. It was just entering the final phase. I didn't go back inside. The farmhouse, with its creaky floorboards and drafty windows, was supposed to be my low-tech sanctuary, but the letter in my mailbox proved that there is no such thing as offline anymore. If they could find me here, they could find me anywhere. I stared at the phone screen until the battery died, the last image being my own face, captured from a distance, looking tired and broken. I was a man being hunted by his own ghost. I stood up, the wood of the porch groaning under my boots, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to hide anymore. I was the one who built the walls. It was time I learned how to tear them down. I spent the next 3 days in a state of hyper-focused preparation. I didn't sleep. I lived on black coffee and the raw adrenaline of a man who has nothing left to lose. I used my old analog truck to drive to a library 3 towns over. I used their public computers masked by 3 layers of VPNs I'd configured on a thumb drive to trace the source of the QR code. It was a rabbit hole that led deep into the dark web to a service called the Mirror Image. It wasn't just one stalker. It was a high-end, bespoke identity theft ring that specialized in erasing people. They didn't just steal your credit card. They harvested your life and sold it to the highest bidder, someone who wanted a fresh start with a clean record and a pre-built history. I was just a product that hadn't been fully packaged yet. When I returned to the farmhouse on the 4th night, the air felt different. The silence wasn't the peaceful quiet of the country. It was the heavy artificial silence of a room that is being recorded. I walked into the kitchen and didn't turn on the kerosene lamp. I sat at the wooden table in the dark, the shotgun leaning against the wall beside me. I waited. I knew the protocol. First, the sensory glitches. Then, the audio anomalies. Then, the physical intrusion. At 2:47 a.m., it began. It wasn't a smart light this time. It was a sound, a faint rhythmic tapping coming from the wall behind the stove. It was the exact cadence of the heartbeat I had heard in the crawl space of the cabin. Tap, 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 tap. I didn't move. I didn't reach for the gun. I just listened. Then a voice came from the darkness of the hallway. It wasn't my mother's voice or my sister's voice. It was mine, the real me. Not the clone, but a recording of a conversation I had with my ex-wife 5 years ago, played back on a hidden battery-powered Bluetooth speaker. "I just want to be left alone, Claire," my recorded voice said, sounding younger, more hopeful. "I just want a place where I can breathe." "You're breathing my air now, Elias," a new voice whispered. This one was physical. It came from the shadows near the cellar door. I grabbed the shotgun and stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't aim. I just waited for the shape to move. A man stepped out of the darkness. He wasn't wearing the resin mask. He wasn't wearing a parka. He was wearing a simple gray suit, the kind I used to wear to board meetings. He had my height, my build, and in the dim moonlight filtering through the window, he had my face. Not a mask, plastic surgery. He had spent the last 18 months not just learning my voice, but carving my features into his own flesh. "The fire was a nice touch," he said. His voice was a perfect match, but there was a coldness in it that I had never possessed. It cleared the slate. The insurance company already processed the claim. The money is in an account you don't even know you have. Your sister thinks you're in a private clinic in Vermont, recovering from the trauma. Your mother thinks you're finally happy. You're already dead, Elias. You're just a lingering piece of metadata. "Who are you?" I asked, my finger tightening on the trigger. "I'm the version of you that succeeds," he replied. He held up a small black device, a remote trigger. "I'm the Elias Thorne who doesn't hide in the woods. I'm the one who finishes the contracts. I'm the one who stays." He moved faster than I thought possible. He didn't lung for me. He lunged for the cellar door. I fired the shotgun, the roar of the blast shattering the windows and filling the kitchen with the smell of sulfur and splintered wood. I missed. He disappeared into the cellar, the heavy wooden door slamming shut. I didn't hesitate. I followed him down. The cellar was a cramped, dirt-floored space filled with old canning jars and the scent of damp earth. I swept the mag light across the room, the beam catching the reflection of a dozen small red lights. He had wired the cellar. It was a miniature version of the server room, a mobile command center powered by lead-acid batteries. I saw him huddled in the corner, his hands flying over the keys of a ruggedized laptop. He wasn't trying to fight me. He was trying to finish the upload. "One more minute," he muttered, his voice strained. "One more minute, and the succession is legally binding. The wills, the deeds, the biometric transfers, they all sync at 3 a.m. I leveled the shotgun at the laptop. "Step away from it." He looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw the madness behind the mimicry. His face, my face, was tight and scarred from the surgeries. He looked like a masterpiece that had been left out in the rain. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I've spent 2 years becoming you. I know the name of your first dog. I know the exact moment you realized your father didn't love you. I am more you than you have been in a decade. You're just the ghost. I'm the man." "You're a parasite," I said. I didn't fire the gun. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the one thing I had salvaged from Marcus Vane's Pelican case. It was a physical kill switch, a hardware worm Marcus had designed to destroy the Echo protocol from the inside out. It was a scorched earth program. It didn't just delete files. It fried the hardware of any server it touched by overriding the voltage regulators. I jammed the thumb drive into his laptop. "What are you doing?" he screamed, lunging for the drive. I kicked him back, the heavy boot hitting his chest. The laptop screen flared a violent electric blue. A high-pitched whine began to emit from the processors. Across the cellar, the banks of batteries began to hiss and smoke. The mirror image network was being backfed a lethal dose of current. "No!" he shrieked, clawing at the keyboard. "It's taking everything. The accounts, the identities. It's all going dark." The laptop exploded in a shower of sparks. The cellar was plunged into absolute darkness as the batteries short-circuited. For a moment, there was only the sound of his ragged, desperate breathing. Then, the sound of a struggle. I felt a hand close around my throat, fingers digging into my windpipe with a strength born of pure desperation. We thrashed on the dirt floor, 2 men with the same face fighting for the right to exist. He was younger, stronger, but I was the one who had built the fortress. I knew how to survive in the dark. I grabbed a heavy glass canning jar from a nearby shelf and smashed it against the side of his head. He groaned and his grip loosened. I didn't stop. I hit him again and again until he stopped moving. I sat there in the dirt, the smell of ozone and blood filling my lungs. I flicked on the mag light. The man who wanted to be me was lying still, his face a ruin of glass and shadows. I checked his pulse. Nothing. The echo had finally been silenced. I spent the rest of the night cleaning up. I didn't call the police. The police wouldn't understand a crime that happened in the cloud. They would just see a dead man who looked like the homeowner. I took the body deep into the woods, to a place where the mountain had swallowed Marcus Vane 3 years ago. I buried him in an unmarked grave, covered by the leaves and the indifference of the Catskills. When the sun rose, I went back to the farmhouse. I took every piece of technology I owned, the burner phones, the laptops, the tablets, and I smashed them with a sledgehammer. I buried the pieces in the garden. I realized then that I couldn't be Elias Thorne anymore. Elias Thorne was a man who lived in the digital world, a man who built walls out of code. That man died in the fire at 142 Whispering Pines Road. If I stayed as him, the protocol would eventually find another successor. There would always be another Echo. I walked to the bathroom and looked in the mirror. I took a pair of shears and cut my hair down to the scalp. I used a straight razor to shave my face until it was raw. I looked at the man in the glass and I didn't recognize him. That was the point. I left the farmhouse that morning with nothing but a backpack and a stack of cash I'd kept hidden in a floorboard. I didn't take the truck. I walked to the main road and hitched a ride with a trucker heading south. It's been a year since the fire. I live in a small coastal town in the Pacific Northwest now. I go by the name of Arthur. I work at a boatyard, sanding hulls and painting decks. My hands are calloused, my skin is weathered by the salt air, and I don't own a single device that connects to the internet. I don't have a social security number that is active. I don't have a bank account. I get paid in cash, and I live in a small shack that has no address. My sister Sarah still thinks I'm in Vermont. Sometimes I see a news report about a senior cybersecurity architect who is making waves in the industry, but the photo is always a bit blurry, or it's an old one from my time at the cabin. I know the mirror image found someone else to fill the void I left. They found a new Elias Thorne to manage the accounts and talk to the mother who thinks her son is finally happy. I am a ghost, and for the first time in my life I feel safe. The walls I build now are made of wood and fiberglass. They don't have back doors, they don't have echoes. But sometimes when the fog rolls in off the ocean and the town goes quiet, I find myself standing by the water, looking at my reflection in the dark waves. I look for the resin mask. I look for the blur in the photo. And then I turn away, because I know the truth now. You can't run from the data. You can only hope that you've become a bug in the system that isn't worth fixing. Check your back seat. Every single time. It only takes 1 second for someone to learn the rhythm of your heart. And once they have the data, they have your soul. If you've ever felt like your life isn't yours anymore, or if your smart home has started talking back in a voice you recognize, let me know in the comments. Subscribe for more true stories that prove the most dangerous thing you own is the one you're holding right now. Stay safe out there. Stay analog.